joined here today by Navneet Bhalla and Vimmi Surti, and they are from Manawi, and they're going to be talking to us about gender-based violence in the South Asian community. This conversation is part of our community conversation series where we discuss different community issues, talking about different demographics of New Jersey and bringing all of that information to you all. So thank you both so much for joining us. Just want to go over a little housekeeping things before we get fully started. So just as a reminder, everybody, this is a live event. We are recording it. It will be streamed live to Facebook, so please be aware of that when you ask questions or if you say anything. Also, please keep yourself muted unless you are being brought up to speak, in which case you can raise your hand if you have a question, or even better, type it in the chat if you'd like. And other than that, I think that is it. I'll turn it over to you both now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Manavi, I want to thank NASW for hosting the event today, and thank you, Annie, for coordinating it and inviting Manavi to be part of it. So today, our legal advocate and I at Manavi will be sharing a presentation to talk about Manavi and go through the various services we do. Feel free to ask questions. We want this to be conversational and interactive and be as helpful as possible. So Vimmi, why don't you start and then I will join in.
Okay, are you going to share the screen, Navneet?
Yeah, here you go. Can you see it now?
Yes, but I think you'll have to scroll up. Go right.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Thank you so much, Navneet. Thank you, Annie. Thanks to NJCD New Jersey chapter for having us. I'll jump in our presentation right away. So Manavi is a South Asian domestic violence agency. Looking at the slide, let's talk about what does South Asian community consist of. So people from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, Maldives, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. This is the community that we serve. Within New Jersey, in the Middlesex County, we see more of Indians and Bangladeshi in the Passaic County. So that's the community primarily that we are serving. Of course, that includes all of the countries in the second slide. Coming to our third, South Asian immigrants. The population that we serve come from various kind of backgrounds, like naturalized citizens. Naturalized citizens, people who have married from those different countries like India or Pakistan, who are on the conditional visa, people who have a 2-year visa, conditional green card, and then people who have become or have been granted legal citizenship by coming from a different country. Temporary workers like H1 and H4 visa holders. It's not just H1 and H4. H4 would be a dependent visa, but we also have survivors who are on L1 and L2 work visa, who are on R1 and R2 religious visa. So those are all kind of dependent visas where the husband is the primary bread earner or the wife is the primary bread earner and the second spouse is the dependent spouse. So that kind of a population where immigration is always a primary issue. So that's the population that we serve, who also have a lot of immigration related questions. And people who are second generation born in the US, which means that the first generation could be their parents who have come here in 70s or 80s, and then kids who are born and raised here who also go through certain sort of a violence. That could be sexual violence, dating violence, domestic violence, and that's the population that we serve. Next slide, please.
So now that we've shared a little bit about the community we serve, I'm going to talk about Manavi as an agency, an organization, and what we stand for. So Manavi means woman in Sanskrit, and Manavi was the very first South Asian women's rights organization founded in the country in 1985. So for the past 35 years, Manavi has been providing culturally specific and linguistically appropriate services to South Asian survivors of domestic violence. we provide, our mission is to end all forms of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence within the South Asian community. We strive to address both the immediate needs of survivors as well as working towards establishing communities which are free from gender-based violence. So just to give you an insight into the services that Manavi provides, we provide a whole range of services which are culturally and linguistically specific, which includes counseling. We have a 24-hour hotline, which is staffed by our DBRT trained volunteers. We have advocacy. We also provide sexual assault support services. We have a robust legal advocacy program, and Vimmi will be sharing more about that later on. We also engage in community outreach and education, which is an important and integral part of our work to ensure that we raise awareness about the culturally specific issues which are involved in addressing gender-based violence in our community. We have an economic empowerment program. We also have, this is probably one of the most valuable services that we have, which is our transitional home, which is called Asiana. And that was founded in 1997, and Vimmi will be discussing that a little bit more. And we also provide trainings. We've done trainings with different police departments throughout New Jersey. Manavi has also was also invited to be part of the advisory board, in fact, statewide, to participate in developing the curriculum for training throughout the state when it comes to cultural humility trainings, which are given to the police departments. Vimmi, do you want to talk a little bit about Asiana here?
Sure. So Asiana, as you can see on the slide, it's our culturally specific transitional home. Asiana is the only cultural specific housing available on the East Coast to South Asian women, and only the third such home in the country. The residence has indeed become a lifeline for South Asian women. During their time at Asiana, residents have the opportunity to resolve various problems and achieve various goals. That includes legal issues, learn English or take English as a second language classes, develop employment skills, obtain driver's license, take education or certification classes, and basically build a self-sustainable lifestyle. Manavi also helps all the residents with, that could be groceries or childcare facilities, in providing resources or any help that they may require in this process. Next slide. Legal advocacy program. Now, as it says, legal advocacy program emerged organically in 1997. All the legal advocacy services that we provide are culturally specific. That includes the legal clinics. Manavi does legal clinics for immigration law through the immigration pro bono attorneys, family law through the family pro bono attorneys every single month. During the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen a big raise in our legal clinics. And we have around 2 to 3 legal clinics every month, both including immigration and family law. Legal referrals, as it says, if there is any kind of any sort of an immigration purpose, or if they or survivors do not have any financial basis to have a solo practitioner lawyers, of course we try to connect them with the resources, with legal referral resources like LSNJ or CJLS and other different resources. Manavi advocates all the staff members wherever the survivors need court accompaniments. We are present to support them emotionally, to help them process their case, to help them process the problems and wherever they need it. We also provide especially cultural trainings to court personnels, like Middlesex County Family Court. That's the best example. Particularly when we talk about the legal clinics, the kind of cases within the immigration law we have seen, like U visa, T visa, asylum cases, People need VAWA, Violence Against Women's Act self-petition. Those are the cases that we have dealt with within the immigration law. Particularly when it comes to family law, some of the issues and the problems that we have discussed with our pro bono family law attorneys includes divorce or separation, equitable distribution of property. The cases are so cultural specific that one spouse is in India, the other spouse is in the United States or in New Jersey. So the jurisdictions are different. At that point, we may have to also make a teamwork where our family law pro bono attorney in New Jersey and the case manager and the attorney in India may have to do a three-way conference call and try to see what resolutions can be brought because the jurisdictions are different. So we have come across some of the complex cases within the legal advocacy program. Next slide.
So as I was mentioning earlier, the Manavi provides support services for domestic violence survivors as well as sexual violence survivors. So we have support services both, and there is intersection between the two forms of violence. So just to touch upon the fact that very often there's this perception or a myth that domestic violence is a physical act. So just to basically clarify to everyone listening that domestic violence comes in many forms. It can be physical, it can be mental, emotional, financial, sexual abuse. Financial abuse is something that we see very, very often. It's very prevalent in our community. And the reason for that is that primarily a lot of the survivors that we serve, we see a significant percentage who may be financially dependent on their spouse, which means the power dynamic is even more so in that particular relationship where the survivor is dependent on the abuser for all their needs. And as you can imagine, during COVID, those challenges have been even worse. So at the best of times, our survivors have barriers and face challenges. But just imagine during a pandemic where the survivor is essentially in quarantine with their abuser. So we've seen that, like Vimmi was mentioning earlier, all our services have continued throughout COVID. We have continued to provide the hotline, our transitional home, all the services have continued, and we've ensured that they're provided. But we have seen challenges where the complexity and the types of cases have been worse. Now, in terms of sexual violence, that includes rape, child sexual abuse, and intimate partner sexual violence. Within the South Asian community, there is definitely stigma and taboo specifically with sexual violence. So that is something that we see as a significant barrier. There is fear to come forward and talk about that. In addition to the power dynamic, there are also specific cultural dynamics, which we will discuss a little bit more. There's also victim blaming and victimization. And this is, we see this in certain countries in South Asia, but we also see it in this country where victim blaming is a huge part of addressing, confronting that when we address gender-based violence. Another really, really important topic that I wanted to mention or talk about was intersectionality. What does that mean? The term intersectionality within the context of gender-based violence means that at Manavi, we recognize that our survivors have intersecting identities based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, disability, class, and more. They have various identities, and we as an agency must ensure that we provide comprehensive services tailored to their needs. Also recognize that our survivors, due to those various intersecting identities, they suffer various structural forms of discrimination based on race and gender. It's also important to point out that survivors of color and marginalized communities have disproportionate experiences of violence across the board. And basically, survivors of color, and marginalized communities have increased barriers in seeking help. And those barriers could include language access, immigration status, and we will go through the various barriers in a few minutes. But it's important that when we talk about addressing gender-based violence, that it's so important and it's so crucial that we look at domestic violence and sexual violence and gender-based violence as a whole through the lens of social justice and human rights, because these are fundamental human rights violations where a survivor is being subjected to violence. And despite domestic and international human rights laws, we see that this is on the rise.
The next slide, statistics, as it says, that 1 in 4 women are raped by their husbands in their lifetime. The statistics of South Asian women, we have also seen that it goes unreported. As it says that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victim of some sort of a physical violence by an intimate partner within their lifetime. Navneet, would you like to add anything to this slide also?
Yeah, I think basically when we talk about statistics, it's just really important to point out that unfortunately, there isn't enough data within South Asian community. And we've had API-GBV has been a fantastic resource. That's the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And they have done many studies, but it tends to be the smaller samples and really only where South Asian survivors feel comfortable in coming forward and sharing their stories because of the stigma that's attached. And in one particular study, Vimmi, as you were sharing earlier, that was done by API-GBV. It was a small sample, but it showed that at least 21% of survivors reported experiencing physical or sexual abuse at the hands of their intimate partner. And at Manavi, we support at least 300 survivors a year. Of course, during the pandemic and other years, it fluctuates and can go up and down, but on average, it's 300 survivors a year that we support.
And what does a victim look like, as this slide says? Honestly, it could be a victim of abuse and it could be anyone. We have received phone calls and we have taken intakes from both genders. So it's not a particular section. However, we have seen more increase of victim abuse, victim blaming among women. Next slide.
Yeah, and just to point out, I guess, usually the point that we want to make is that very often people may think that there is a certain profile of a victim or a certain profile of an abuser. And the fact really is that anyone can be a victim and anyone out there can be an abuser. It isn't a specific demographic. It isn't a specific type of person or profession or class or someone from a socioeconomic status or culture. Anyone can be a victim or an abuser. Vimmi, you wanted to talk about this?
Sure. So I'll add some points from my experience. Why doesn't the victim just leave? I have done cases where I've heard survivors saying strange things. My parents want me to live in this marriage. Once I have the baby, things will be fine. What will people say? What will the society say if you leave? These are all different kind of statements that have been made within the South Asian culture. There is also myth, if only she left the relationship, or a friend circle may say, if she just left a relationship, everything would have been fine. However, it's not that easy to live. Or the in-laws may say, well, you're not dressing up in a certain way. Or the parents may say, who is going to provide you financially? We do not have the money. So these are all the kind of statements where it is just not easy for a female to just step out and leave and start a fresh life. Go ahead, Navneet.
Okay, so there are as I was mentioning earlier, there are various barriers that impact South Asian survivors, in addition to specific cultural and linguistic barriers, which I'll discuss here. So I think one of the things that we see that there is deep-rooted patriarchy within the South Asian community. And I may add that it's not specific to the culture. I personally feel this deep-rooted patriarchy generally is a general rule that we need to dismantle and we need to address across all communities and across all cultures, and it's prevalent. But within the South Asian community, the patriarchal culture can also extend to extended family. So we very often see that domestic violence isn't just between the spouses, it extends to the in-laws, and there have been situations and cases where restraining orders are taken, and then the in-laws or brother-in-law, sister-in-law, or father-in-law, mother-in-law who may be living in that setting, if they are part of the abuse and they're also exhibiting abusive behavior and subjecting the survivor to abuse, and they would be considered perpetrators. So we see that cultural dynamic. Within, as far as discussing sexual violence, as I'd mentioned earlier, it's definitely, there's stigma attached to that where sexual violence is not discussed or talked about openly within the community. And it's both domestic violence and sexual violence very often are considered issues which the community feels are private. And I think this again is something that we see across different communities, but within the South Asian community particularly, there are concerns about keeping it private, dealing with it within the community, because it's considered as a family matter and a private matter. One of the biggest barriers that I do want to talk about, and this is something every platform that I've ever spoken at has come up as a huge issue, and Manavi is a significant issue, and that is language access and immigration status. Most of our survivors have linguistic barriers and we have lack of language access. So I just want to paint this picture for everyone listening. Imagine that you move to a country as an immigrant. You don't know the language, you don't know the systems, you don't know the laws, you don't have your family, you don't have your friends, you don't have a support system. And then the very person who you felt or expected would be your partner and someone who would support you turns out to be the abuser. That's the dynamic that we are faced with, and that's the dynamic our survivors are faced with, where we see that because of language access, I personally have seen cases, in particular case, where just because of language access, when the police was called, the survivor was unable to articulate their case in English fully. So the in-laws or the extended family present on the scene were able to give their account, which meant that the police report essentially had their account on paper. And believe it or not, by the time we got the paperwork and I read it firsthand, I said to the survivor that here it says that you're the defendant. It says that you're the one who assaulted somebody. And she had no idea that that's what was said. She had no idea that that was the story that was presented because of lack of language access. And we eventually spent over a year addressing the case within the criminal context and the criminal charges to get them dismissed. And I just want to point out that this is a tactic that we have seen more and more often, where the abuser has used immigration status as a way to abuse the survivor further. And to clarify, the whole point of having criminal charges filed against an immigrant who's on a dependent immigration visa is because they would then be subject to deportation. And that is another additional layer of abuse. And in this particular instance, the judge had said to the survivor, because you've got this criminal charge, I must let you know that you may be subject to deportation. And this is something that we have seen over and over, where language access, or I should say lack of language access, and immigration status are two very, very significant barriers where our survivors are unable to get equal access to justice and equal access to support services. And just another thing on the immigration status also is that when a survivor's immigration status is dependent on their abuser, we've had many situations where the abuser will say and threaten the survivor that if you report this abuse, I will report you to law enforcement and you will be deported. Of course, these are false allegations. These are false claims. But for a survivor who is unaware of the system, of the laws, of what their immigration status and what rights are attached to their immigration status, they feel threatened. And I think that further builds a lack of trust with law enforcement or a fear of reporting to law enforcement because their immigration status and their whole right to be in this country and be safe is dependent on their abuser.
I think Navneet said, yeah, sure. Navneet said it so well. She pretty much emphasized every single point here, that there are social pressures, there is bias against divorce, there is shame attached to it, there is guilt, embarrassment, fear of losing custody of the kids. We see that almost in all our family law cases. Financial difficulties to an extent where the spouse does not have a bank account or just has a joint bank account and not a personal account, and she pretty much ends up putting the entire salary in the joint account. These are mental health trauma. There is so much of a mental health problem that I personally have come across within our community. It's a stigma. People don't talk about it. People don't seek help. People don't know that there is a facility like a therapist that they can go to. There is a health insurance problem, or somebody's dependent on the other spouse health insurance. So they do not know how to navigate the healthcare systems. So I think Navneet pretty much covered all the issue, but these are definitely some of the barriers that we see every single day with our survivors. Yes, next slide.
I just want to add something, Vimmi, here, just before we move on to the next one. Just to give, I just want everyone listening to get a better insight on the real life examples that we see. Of course, we do not and will not share any confidential details, but just to give a sense of like hypothetical situations where financial abuse has become such a significant concern during COVID for us. It has always been a concern, but I think during the pandemic, it's reached a different level of concern where we've seen survivors where they would rather remain in an abusive relationship because they feel the fear out there of COVID and the pandemic is so much worse, because their fundamental needs like shelter, groceries, bills, even basic things like we've had survivors where in order for them to ensure that their children can have access to education through remote learning, they don't have access to technology, they don't have access to devices with language barriers, and then having to support their children with remote learning with no technology and no support system. When they weigh all these factors, for them, there's been situations where survivors would rather remain and have expressed that they'd rather remain in the abusive relationship for the sake of the kids, for the sake of the resources that they're able to continue to get, because of fear of what would happen if they are out there during a pandemic. So that has been a concern for us. And also, whether it's social services, whether it's the legal process, the courts, there have been delays, and we have seen delays for survivors, especially like if they're trying to get a TRO or FRO. And the other piece we also see is lack of the accurate interpretation. So one piece that's really prevalent again is that when our survivors go to court, sometimes or very often they may get the wrong interpreter because there is this perception that, oh, this language is similar to this, and, Hindi is similar to Punjabi, and what we see, and I myself, to give you an example, witnessed a situation where the survivor, the expression being used was that he was choking me. But in interpretation, it was translated as he grabbed me by the neck collar. It's very different, very different. As we all know, the distinction between what the law says and what the legal consequences would be if it said someone was being choked in a domestic violence case, as opposed to someone who may be grabbed by the neck or the collar. So there are various South Asian languages and dialects that are spoken. And I think it's so key, because for us, language access really equates for us with safety. That if they don't have that and their case is not accurately articulated or accurately reported by law enforcement and in court, that means that they can essentially become left in a situation which is much more safe and dangerous for the survivor. Vimmi, do you want to go on to talk about the next one?
Sure. How to support someone? I think we all know this, that let the survivor come. The way we support them is just not be judgmental. Let's listen to their story. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Listening is the best thing, I suppose, because they themselves sometimes do have the answers. It's just that that voice is so much overlapped with other layers of information that they themselves don't know how to navigate. We as Manavi, as an organization, are always there to help them with whatever needs, especially they need during that present moment. As Navneet said, may that be grocery, may that be financial assistance, may that be connecting them with the resources. So we, as a staff and as an organization, have realized to have a very proactive role, sometimes even out of our office hours, to make sure that every single need of a survivor that comes to us is being taken into consideration and is fulfilled at that particular moment. We do not make decisions for them. This is a very big one, which we all have learned, that do not make decisions for them, but help them process, listen to them. And if that takes quite a long time in reaching a final decision that they want to seek or they need to come up with, just give them time and support them. And Navneet, you can add more points to it.
No, I think you covered it. To be honest, the one thing that I'll end with, and then we absolutely want to hear from everybody and any questions they might have. Anyone listening right now who may feel that they need support, we just want you to know that at Manavi, we are here for you. We support you, we believe you, and you can reach us at any time. We have a 24-hour hotline, and I'm going to share the number. It's 732-435-1414. If you feel it's unsafe for you to make a call during COVID, during pandemic, which is something we have absolutely seen, you can reach us at our email, manavi@manavi.org. You can also reach us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whichever means of communication is the safest for you. Please know that we are here to support you, and your safety is of the utmost concern, and that's something that we'll do everything to make sure that you're safe and supported. Thank you so much. Thank you, Annie. So I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you both so much for that. That was so informative, really eye-opening, some of the statistics that you shared as well. I do want to invite everybody to please put any questions or comments that you may have in the chat, or if you'd like to speak, if you want to unmute yourself and speak, you can raise your hand or let us know in the chat that you have a comment. But a question that came to my mind, you touched upon it a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted your work, but I just wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more on that. How has it affected both your clients, but just also the way that you're delivering the services?
Sure. So, like most agencies, we were absolutely impacted by COVID-19, and our survivors were significantly impacted. Manavi has continued to provide all services remotely. So what that essentially means is that we've continued to provide support groups online, but through Zoom and other platforms. So we've provided support groups. Our legal clinics have continued remotely. Our counseling, advocacy, 24-hour hotline, all of the services have basically, we've ensured that we continue those. And also with our transitional home, of course, we also have made the judgment call and made an assessment that where the survivor needs to have in-person counseling, or where the survivors, and this is something absolutely more so in Asiana, in our transitional home, where survivors have needed that in-person support, we've ensured that that was provided, but in a safe manner. So it's safe for both the survivor and the advocate. Even with court accompaniments, initially there was a gap and that wasn't happening, but once the courts started to open and all the safety protocols were being followed, Manavi staff did continue and ensured that they accompanied survivors in court. The other pieces, as far as what we've seen with survivors, we have definitely seen the heightened need for groceries. That has huge need. As soon as I think the shutdown started mid-March, in March, we started to notice how our transitional home, Asiana, because we used to have our dedicated volunteers who would every week deliver culturally specific groceries to our transitional home for the women and the child that lives there. But that obviously became more of a concern. But I want to shout out and give a shout out to everyone who stepped in to support us. We had our statewide coalition, NJCD, who they were fantastic and really supported Manavi. We're lucky to have them because they helped with groceries, they helped with the PPE. We also had many volunteers or community members across the board who stepped in to provide donations when we needed them most. We even had banks who helped us. So just to sum up that, I think groceries were a huge need. We also had survivors, and I think Vimmi can speak to this, as survivors who had issues such as their Wi-Fi was being cut off by the abuser, their phone being taken away by the abuser. There were things that escalated to the point where the abuser during COVID, they were making sure that the survivor was totally isolated and cut off from any support system. Correct, Vimmi?
That's right. Navneet pretty much covered it. And she's right. We have seen cases escalate at a very high level of violence. Wi-Fi was cut off, no cell phone, no technology, so no laptop or a computer or access to any technology, television, even electricity. I had few survivors where the electricity was cut off because the other spouse was served TRO, which became a shock, so he was asked to get out, and then the electricity was cut off. And they did not have had very limited English proficiency language, so did not know how to have a dialogue with the police officers. So even if the police is at home, they did not know how to interact with the police officer. So we have seen violence which has gone on a very different level. And I must say, as a staff member, that Navneet and our other staff members had to have case discussions, make a team, because these were not the cases with a one staff member could resolve. These were complex cases where the entire team had to come together, strategize, and see how all the needs are being taken care in an accurate manner, where we bring a survivor from, we take that survivor and make sure that that survivor has been given sufficient needs to empower herself. This was not an easy task, and COVID-19, right when March came and things started shutting down, we have seen case by case increasing not only in terms of violence, but also in terms of the complexity, where it was not just one need, multiple needs were arising sequentially.
You know, there's one, I just want to share a quick example. This wasn't at our agency, but another culturally specific agency, but it's something that we've heard a lot, is a survivor in terms of remote education. It was a South Asian survivor, and they had to use their telephone. They had to use their cell phone. They had to use their cell phone to teach classes to their child at home, because that was the only device they had where the teacher could send the class notes. And this was early on. Of course, they were supported later on, but they went through the initial COVID period. We were hearing stories we had not heard before, things that I, as a mother, take for granted. My son has a device, and he just got on and, you know, was teaching. But to hear those things were really heart-wrenching, where basic support services or basic support, you know, tools were not available to survivors. And I also want to point out that at Manavi, and this is true for all DV agencies, the staff and volunteers really, really stepped up. I can speak as an ED that I have never seen our staff and volunteers literally blend the weekdays and weekends where they are. We were at a point where everyone was going above and beyond during COVID period to do everything possible to support survivors, because it was such a difficult period for everyone. So I want to thank everyone for that too.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been seeing that in COVID-19, you know, the stepping up and coming together to really provide all the things that we normally do, and in some ways have kind of taken for granted the accessibility of being able to do our day-to-day lives. So that's really great that you have that support in your organization. There are some questions in the chat that I know Vimmi did answer, but for those who are listening in or on Facebook, I do want to answer them aloud. So yes, this is being recorded, and if Vimmi and Navneet want to share the slides, I can send them out to everybody who is joining us. But somebody had asked, are services available for all New Jersey residents, regardless of county of residence?
Yes, we are a statewide agency, so our services are available to everyone in New Jersey. In fact, we also have supported survivors from out of state, where we've had calls from different parts of the country, and wherever we are able to provide that service, we do. And we also provide services to survivors from South Asia, meaning there's something called transnational abandonment, where survivors come to this country, they're married, and then their spouse abandons them back in the country, and the child is here, for example. So they take the child and have the child here and abandon the survivor back in South Asia, in India or Pakistan or so. So we actually work with survivors who may currently be abandoned in those countries and separated from their children, because like I said, I can't emphasize this enough. We take it for granted that most of us know to call 911. Most of us know where the police, you know, who to call, where to go to, but survivors who don't know, and don't know how to navigate the system in a country that they're unfamiliar with, abusers know how to get around the system. And that is something we see very often, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. Another follow-up question to that was, is it typical that the family in the United States would be the husband's family that the survivor is living with if there's extended family in the United States? They said that they have a few clients who tell them that the entire family is abusing them.
That is correct. I mean, I can't speak for every family, but from Manavi's experience, what we do see is the cultural dynamic I was speaking about, that survivor situations where survivors do stay with the husband's family. And yes, it's more often, if not most or all the time, that it's the husband's family. And then the abuse isn't limited to just the spouse, it's the in-laws as well. Again, I'm not speaking for every family and for everyone. You know, my in-laws are wonderful. There are a lot of family dynamics and families are wonderful, but I'm just giving examples that this is a factor, a significant factor within the South Asian community that we do see and we do address and take very seriously, because the abuser is not just the spouse, it's also the extended family who may be living and abusing the survivor together.
Great. And another question that had come up. So, you know, you provided a lot of wonderful resources on how to support someone who may be going through this, but you had also mentioned that the biggest barrier to access is language, and, you know, if issues with language access. How do we improve language access, especially, you know, if you're maybe a white or non-South Asian social worker or, you know, person working with this community? How can we improve that access for them?
I think some of the ways that can be improved, you know, so this is something we bring up, like I said, in every meeting, every forum. So I would request that anyone who's working with a South Asian survivor, or working with, to be honest, any member of the community where language access is a barrier, that this can be someone from any community, ensure that you take the time to understand their linguistic needs, and not to assume that, okay, one dialect may be the same as the other. So taking the time to listen, and taking the time to ask, which language do you speak, and what is your primary language, and not say, okay, well, you don't speak it, so why don't we ask your family member or someone else who's around you? Because we take a survivor-centered approach, which means that survivor essentially is the one who knows their situation best, and we must listen to the survivor and the survivor only. So if you're in a police setting, if you're in a court setting, if you're in social services, if you're in hospital, any system within where you come into contact with someone who doesn't speak English fluently, I think it's so important to be the one. If you have the privilege and are someone who's privileged enough to speak the language and know the system, to be there to say, hold on a minute, let's find out what language. And there should be signage. There's usually signage where it says that if you don't speak English, and in all these, we always advocate that depending on the county and the state, certain languages which are really common, basic things should be interpreted and translated and posted in all those agencies. We've advocated that in Middlesex County Court, where we've said, you know, Gujarati or Hindi or Punjabi, some basic instructions should be translated and posted publicly in those, like, if you need help, contact here. If you don't speak the language, go to this office. If, you know, basic things which be translated for someone who, I guess the best way to do it is, imagine you don't speak the language and you're walking into a setting that you need to navigate. What are some of the things that you feel would be helpful to have instructions for? So translated document in public settings, making sure you advocate when you're in a setting and someone is saying, Lord, let's talk to their friend or family, that doesn't cut it. We just need to ensure that we get the right interpreter, and call Manavi. All our staff and volunteers speak a whole range of South Asian languages. And one of the services we do provide is interpretation. We've had many situations where someone from social services or law enforcement will call us just for interpretation. They'll say, we're trying to talk to this survivor. They don't speak the language. Can you help? So our staff actually step in and interpret for anyone that calls us for that. We've had other agencies we've helped as well. So call us.
Yeah, and going off of that, we had another question. You know, you had said before that a lot of survivors don't know their rights in, you know, the systems that we have here. So are they able to request, you know, a interpretation, or maybe a particular police, law enforcement, or some type of service? Like, what is their rights in those situations? What can they request?
Yes, the courts are required to provide an interpreter. They're all supposed to provide interpreters, and they're supposed to ask the survivors, do you need an interpreter? And when the survivor says yes, which language? So in every court hearing and in any interaction with law enforcement or police, the starting point is that they're supposed to ask if you need an interpreter, and then the onus is on that agency to provide the interpreter. So the concern that we have, or the issues we see, are that very often the right interpreter is not provided for the right language. And there is this issue with different dialects, and that's where the misinterpretation comes in, or the level of interpretation is not up to par. But yes, in all these settings with court hearings, there are court interpreters. They are provided. Language Line is a service that is provided, but our concern is that we see at times that because of the dialect and the similarity in the languages, they are not accurate interpretations.
And Annie, I will just add one point to what just Navneet said. I have helped lawyers when there is a final restraining order hearing with the trial, where these are non-South Asian lawyers, so they do not know the language, but pre-COVID, they would sit in a conference room, prepare the client. My part would be only to interpret, but the lawyer would be present there, the client would be present there. And sometimes, even when I interpret a particular, the context has to be very important. And sometimes a person who does not speak the South Asian language may not be able to vocalize it, but by looking at the gesture and the body language, they do get the feel that, okay, what exactly had happened in that. Now, when you take that same case to the court, yes, the court does give a certified interpreters, but maybe that certified interpreter, as Navneet had initially said, would not be able to know the context. And that's where the trial may go somewhere wrong, or there could be a disconnect. And I think at that point, the legal advocate or case manager's role would be to inform the lawyer during the recess or during the break that this is not the context, and if something can be brought in the courtroom at that point. And I have seen when we have other agencies who take our help with the interpretation, as I said, when there are in-person meetings, that definitely helps for a non-South Asian person to understand as to what the context is. During the COVID, I particularly have done interpretation in Gujarati and Hindi languages, especially for the lawyers, on the telephone, sometimes even via Zoom, if that's what they feel more comfortable. But I believe that context is very important, and Navneet highlighted, in order to have that accuracy, giving enough time, step by step, and not reaching to assumptions or conclusions is extremely important.
Great, thank you. I know we only have a few minutes left. This question did come in the chat about, do you offer support groups, and what support groups do you offer?
Yes, we do, and I'll have Vimmi share that we do offer support groups, and we offer support groups right now remotely. Vimmi, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So we do offer support groups. Our support groups are every other month, and I must say that NJCD has provided a great lot of support in the curriculum of the support group. And we do it via Zoom, and sometimes the survivors, if they feel more comfortable to be on the phone call, they join us via their phone call. And within the South Asian community, what I have realized in our support groups, that they really want to vent it out and talk about their problems and find a mutual connection. So I think our support groups have really, really helped. It's a confidential information, but just knowing that I'm not the only one who is going through this problem is a very big emotional support. And there is a sense of belongingness that, okay, I belong to this particular community and I have people there. And I think that our support groups have done phenomenal. Our evaluations have, everyone who have taken the support group, they have mentioned that they look forward for the support group. So it has been a very self-fulfilling process.
Thank you. I did put the link for NJCD in the chat if anybody wants to look at it. October is actually Domestic Violence Awareness and Prevention Month, interestingly enough, so this is very timely. But I do want to be mindful that we only have 5 minutes left, and so I really, truly thank you both for this presentation and for providing all this information to everybody. And as Vimmi had said, we'll share the slides with you afterwards, but I don't know if you have any final thoughts or if you want to just share your information. I know that you have that last slide there.
Oh, yes. Basically, this is just our phone number again. This is 732-435-1414. It's the same number that actually becomes the hotline, the 24-hour hotline after 6 p.m. So 9 to 6, if you call, you'll be able to speak to any of our staff advocates from 6 p.m. onwards. We have DVRT trained volunteers who staff our hotline throughout the night and then the next day and at weekends. And that's our website. Please feel free to visit the website. And also, like I said earlier, email is manavi@manavi.org. And you can reach us anytime and we will be there to support you.
Again, thank you both, Vimmi and Navneet, so much for this talk. It was really awesome. We have this recorded. It will be available on our YouTube page as well as on our Facebook. If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful day. And thank you all again.
Thank you.